Okay, hey everybody, and I'm going to assume people can hear me unless the chat starts blowing up otherwise. Feel free to put in questions to chat. I probably won't be able to watch it too closely, but I will look forward to talking to questions afterwards. I'll try to save a few minutes for that. And as Alicia mentioned, I had the great pleasure and honor to come to Riemann Gardens about a month ago now for their Plants and Climate Change Symposium, which I thought was fascinating and really enjoyed being a part of. And following up on that, Alicia invited me to come speak with your group. And what I'll do today then is sort of give a talk in, let's see, okay, there we go, a talk in three parts. And the first two parts will be familiar to you if you did come to my talk at Riemann Gardens. And it's designed for a general audience, but I think it carries lots of interest for scientific audiences from other disciplines as well. I'm a paleoecologist, a geologist by training. So a lot of my work is studying past climate change and past plant species and community responses to climate change. And as we can see, there's all kinds of crossover from what we've seen in the past to what we're seeing around us now and to how we might help plant communities and plant species adapt to current climate change. So that'll be the structure of the first two parts here. And then the third, I'll do a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the science side. And here what I'll focus on is some of our community efforts to go from our many individual site level records of past ecological and plant community change to building up global scale networks to look at continental to global scale responses of ecosystems to past and recent climate change. Okay, so that's the setup for today. Let's see, here we go. Okay, so just to kind of set the stage, let's rewind the clock just 19,000 years. And a moment ago, you saw a beautiful photo of the Madison campus just up the road from you. And whereas you were south of the ice sheets 20,000 years ago, Madison itself was pretty much right under and right at the edge of the former ice sheets. And there's kind of an inset map there. That red dashed line is a reasonably good map of the former. It's actually the Ice Age trail, but that kind of follows the track of the ice sheets in the past. And then for kind of a visual comparison, here's a glacier in Iceland today. So just getting across the idea that not that long ago, we had ice sitting on top of half of North America. And then to put it in perspective, the global temperature change from the last ice age 20,000 years ago today is about 6 degrees Celsius. So this really tells us that what seems like a small number, 5 degrees global warming, 6 degrees global warming, completely changed our world, completely changed North America. 14,000 years ago, as the ice is retreating, we now have these megafauna. Humans are arriving in the Americas. And if you look closely, some of these plant communities are pretty different from today. We have these kind of open boreal mixed parklands. We have spruces and larches interspersed with ash and some elm and other things. And so there's these kind of unusual mixtures of taxa and plant species that we don't see on modern landscapes. And it's not just the animals, it's the plants themselves. So to summarize some of the things that we have learned from these past records is that we have seen many large past climate changes and ecological responses to those climate changes. We can see that there are these major ecosystem transformations triggered by past climate change. And yet we also often see that individual species show a high persistence and ability to survive very large climate changes in the past. We can start to identify characteristics of climate resilient landscapes that are seen to be particularly good at preserving biodiversity during past and present climate change. And then this leads us to some species adaptation strategies. Okay, so to kind of set the stage and set the context, one of the great advances over the last 50 years is that we now have a very good, well understood climatic history of the Earth system over the last 60 million years. And I've summarized it here. We have understandings going further back in time. I'm just starting the clock at 60 million years ago. And as always, there's more research to be done. So this isn't perfect knowledge, but there's a lot that we do know and that we can summarize here. And to get people oriented, the vertical axis is change in temperature relative to the late 20th century. So positive values would be warm, in the past was warmer than present by 5, 10, 15 degrees Celsius. And then negative values would be times in the past when climates were colder than present. Okay, so that's the vertical axis. And then the horizontal axis, the key thing to notice here is that the time scale is stretching as we go to the right. We start off at tens of millions of years ago. We then shift into millions of years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago, the last 20,000 years, and then we move into the instrumental record and then off into these scenarios for the future here. And so this is encompassing that there's many different time scales. We have a long sweep of Earth's climate history, and there's different patterns and processes operating at different time scales. And it helps put in context what's happening and is projected to happen today. So over the last 60 million years, you can, and that starts with the meteorite strike and the end of the dinosaurs. The big story has been Cenozoic cooling, that we've had this widespread cooling of the Earth system, ice sheets starting to initiate in the southern and northern hemispheres over this time period. We go from an ice-free world at the time of the dinosaurs, long-term cooling, and that these temperatures were 10 to 15 degrees warmer than present. So it's a very warm world in the past. Cooling, cooling, cooling. You might start to notice higher variability. This is when ice sheets start to initiate. They start to destabilize the climate system. They start to create larger swings in the climate system. You can see these swings starting to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then we get into the last, really this is the last million years, but I've just shown the last 400,000 years. We have these very regular repeated ice ages, or we say glacials and interglacials. The glacials are shorts. They are kind of at or a little bit warmer than the current interglacial. They tend to last 10,000 years. And the glacials are cold and long. They last 80 to 90,000 years, and there's some reversals along the way. So abrupt terminations, abrupt warmings, brief interglacials, long, steady cooling. That's the pattern for the last million years. And now here we are 20,000 years ago. And this is the part I'm going to focus on the most today. This is the time period and system I really focus on. And this is 20,000 years ago. This is the last ice age. And over this time period, we've had a global warming of about 5 degrees Celsius up to the Holocene and the last 10,000 years of relatively stable temperatures, continuing into the 20th and 21st century, which is the time period of almost the entirety of our scientific observations, weather stations, botanical surveys, and everything else. And then you head off into the 21st century and the different scenarios. And each of these different colored scenarios represent different scenarios of how much fossil fuel would we burn under a blue scenario or a red scenario, and then the climate model saying how much warming would we get given that fossil fuel burning scenario. So this really helps put lots of things in perspective. You can see that a range of what we've observed in our instrumental record, and even over the period of our civilized society and of human species itself, is only a small subsample of the broader range of climate variability in the Earth system. We've had much warmer times in the past. We've had much colder times in the past. And that the future scenarios that we project are of concern because they are rapid and large and lots of things happening, but they're not unprecedented in some ways. We do have some context for them in the past. Okay, so now to dive in more to this last 20,000 years, we're going to really focus on, kind of a nice sort of beginning and end here, where the beginning, we have ice sheets across most of the northern hemisphere, including most of North America, and then today would be the second state for comparison. Over this time period, there's a couple different curves here. The yellow is the carbon dioxide. This is from the ice cores and the bubbles in the ice cores. We can see that CO2 was about 180, 190 parts per million. For a plant biologist, that itself is very interesting because that's pretty close to the limits of what a C3 plant can handle and still survive. So we're kind of getting close to the limits of C3 physiology there. And then CO2 levels rise. And then you can see a very close tracking of temperature. We have Antarctic temperature and global temperature curves. And this paper was kind of interested in how those two are similar and different. But big picture, there's a very close tracking of temperature to CO2. So one of the things we see from the past is that when CO2 goes up, temperatures go up. There's a very strong sensitivity of the climate system to CO2. Again, from kind of a biogeographer's perspective, and of course, knowing that many of our plants in the US have this interesting, complex biogeographic histories, one thing to remember is that the glacier world of the last million years is kind of the normal world for most plants over the last million years. We've had long 80 to 90,000 year glacial periods and short interglacial periods, 10,000 years. The Holocene that we're in today is the most recent interglacial. And so for most of the last million years, the map you see here is kind of the standard state of the system. Ice sheets across North America that effectively cut off the lower 48 from Beringia. Sea level is 120 meters lower. And so Alaska is connected through the exposed Bering Straits to Eurasia. There's a famous Wallace line between between Australia and New Guinea, which were one continent at the last ice age, and sort of Southeast Asia, which is all one landmass, no very few islands, 20,000 years ago. And so the whole connectivity and the way that species disperse and where species can live is entirely different 20,000 years ago, which again is the norm for the last million years ago versus today. Okay, so from kind of broad context to the kind of work that my lab and my community do, we work with lake sediments and marshes, and there's lots of lakes and marshes around the upper Midwest. Paleoecology, many of you know, has been around since the early 20th century. It's a well tried and true method. Pollen grains their exospore pollen is very resistant, and so if you put that pollen in a low oxygen environment like the bottom of a lake or a marsh, that pollen can effectively survive indefinitely. We have 60 million year old pollen grains, no problem. So the sediments at the bottom of the lake are steadily accumulating upwards over time. They have a sediment accumulation rate around here on average of about 10 years per centimeter. So let 1,000 years go by and you'll have a meter of mud. And so many of the lakes in Wisconsin and areas around us have about 15 meters or so of mud at the bottom of them, representing 15,000 years, give or take, of ecological history and changing composition of all the plants that have lived around that lake as environments have changed over time. And it's not just pollen. You can see there's lots of other things that we can pull from these lake sediments: radiocarbon dates to get their ages, charcoal flecks in the sediments for fire histories, various isotopic signatures for water balance, organic biomarker signatures, often microglia produced for temperature. Ancient DNA is kind of the hot field right now and rising, and then various other fossils, diatoms, and so forth. And this kind of work has been going on for decades now. There's early work in the 1940s, and of course technologies have gotten better and better over time. But here's every dot here represents some lake, some mire, where someone has collected a fossil pollen record and published that paper and then put the data into our community database, the Neotoma Paleoecology database that I'll talk more about coming up. And I'll kind of give a highlight here from Colo Marsh. And Devil's Lake is another iconic one and a beautiful site. I often use that as the example for Wisconsin audiences. But Colo Marsh, just down the road from you all, wetland and bird sanctuary. You can Dick Baker, in a 1990 paper in the Journal of Iowa Sciences, took a sediment core from here, worked up the pollen and other taxa, worked up the radiocarbon dates. And so here we see an ecological history from Colo Marsh going back about 13,000 years. At technicality, it's actually 13,000 radiocarbon years, which is more like 15,000 years in the true calendar system. We're not going to worry about that here. We'll just stick on the radiocarbon time scale. But let's kind of focus kind of qualitatively on the big things that have happened over this last 13,000 years or so. And the first thing we see is that Colo Marsh, and 13 to 11,000 years ago, there was lots of spruce pollen. So we're going from, we look at this the way that geologists do, in which the oldest sediments are at the bottom and the youngest sediments are at top. So time is going up. And then each curve here represents a different plant taxon, usually at the genus level or family level, that we have, at each sediment horizon, we've counted, or somebody has counted, let's say 300 pollen grains and identified each of those pollen grains to the best of their ability to different plant taxa. And so we then see here that, this early period, the end of the last ice age, there's lots of spruce living around here. There's a spruce parkland, spruce forest, there's mastodons roaming the landscape over this time period. Then we see another period in which the spruce starts to decline. We get these hardwoods, ash, elm, and oak developing. So maybe this kind of mesic hardwood forest here. You can see a little bit of alder in there. Then clearly things dry out. So we're starting to see multiple things going on here. There is a temperature change, and as temperatures rise, spruce forests are declining and dying out, hardwood forests establish. And then the next thing we're starting to see here is a moisture change, that it's drying out. The Great Plains start to aridify, the forest retreats or dies off or gets burned off, and then various prairies establish. So we think of this area as the Great Plains now, and it is, but the Great Plains are about 8,000 years old in this particular site. And of course, I'm focusing on climatic factors, but it's really important to notice that humans are on this landscape. They're modifying fire regime, they're doing silviculture and so forth. So there's this, one of the major research areas in my field is understanding sort of human climate, vegetation, fire, megafauna, all the different sort of interacting systems and how they're all affecting these dynamics we see here. Okay, so then we see this prairie period, and then there's some signs that it might have gotten a little bit wetter, and we moved away from a kind of a pure prairie to maybe more of an oak woodland savanna. We see oak pick up a bit here, and so, and then that's kind of the state of this system until circa 1840 or so, when European and Euro-American settlers arrive and clear and farm and everything else. So we can see that just at this one site here, we've had 4 major ecosystems pass through over the last 15,000 years, all that can be attributable to various kinds of climate changes. So that's one site. Now what we're looking at here is a new mapping resource just created, just out this year, called Range Mapper, and it's great for public presentations. It's great for teaching. I fully encourage everybody to use it. We love to have as many people as possible using this resource. I'm playing this to you as a kind of a pre-built animation that you can see going through here, but it is an interactive web resource. So if you go to this link here, geography.wisc.edu Range Mapper, you can start to play with it yourself. You can choose which of these taxa to look at and view. You can also choose North America, Europe, and the Indo-Pacific. We've got 3 different regions you can play with. Slight typo in the link there, Alicia, but thanks for putting links in. You can and so just let's just kind of rewind it again there. Just focus on a couple taxa. Focus on the blue and the red, the spruce and the oak here. You can see spruce up here, oak down here, and what we're going to start to watch here is spruce filling in areas vacated by the ice sheet, spruce dying out and getting replaced by oak and other taxa, and spruce expanding northwards. So we can, and I'm just focusing on 2 taxa, 2 regions here, but we can start to see lots of things going on. And if you start to look closely, you can also watch the expansion of grasses and the establishment of the Great Plains. There is lots of phenomena to look at here. It's a really rich set of animations to play with. Trying to, there we go. Oops, there we go. Nothing clicked and everything clicked all at once. All right. So what we can take away from these kinds of maps in which we are looking at many sites and changes in abundances of, this is all based on pollen abundances from these sediments of different time periods and localities, is that we can start to see one thing we see very clearly is this reshuffling of communities into what we call novel ecosystems. That, for example, spruce and ash 20,000 years ago, there wasn't a lot of ash and there's a lot of spruce. And then between 15 and 13,000 years ago, there was lots of spruce and ash, and they're kind of living in the same places, or these kind of spruce ash, parklands, mixed parklands. And then today, of course, we think of spruce as mainly up in northern Wisconsin and Canada. We think of ash as mostly a temperate tree. You can sort of see that in the maps here. They're mostly disaggregated. So their co-association in the past is something we don't see today, except in kind of rare circumstances. So this kind of point that as climates change, species move and abundances change, and each species is following its own trajectory. We can also look at the rate of response, and this is a really nice site. Now we're over in Switzerland, but it's a great site for making this point, so I show it. We have at this one record, we have a temperature reconstruction based upon oxygen isotopes. We see this big step change, this big warming of several degrees in just a few decades. We can then see that the sage-sedge community basically instantly, within, let's say, 10 years or so, converts. Junipers take off. It becomes a juniper woodland with little or no time lag. Then birch starts to arrive maybe a century or 2 later. And then pine expands about 800 years later. So we're starting to see this. I think a kind of a rule of thumb is that if you have a given set of plant species at a given site, climate change can operate very fast and very effectively. Some species reproductive rates are enhanced, some species are suppressed, and you get a very quick community change. And then if you're thinking about, well, migration and the dispersal of seeds from refugial populations through the pass of the Alps into this new site, that can take centuries. So there's this mixture of fast and slow responses of plant communities to climate change. We can also see that there's very few well-documented extinctions, and I'm giving you the exception to the rule. There's this nice paper from Jackson and Wang that, based upon cross-section needle morphology of Picea spruce needles, these are cross-sections here of extant species, red, black, and white spruce. These ones in boxes are what's been attributed to a now extinct species, Picea critchfeldii, that appears to have been probably a cool temperate conifer living down here and is retrieved from sediments from the last ice age. Doesn't exist anymore to our knowledge. So this species appears to have actually been gone extinct with the end of the last ice age, but that's the exception. And I'm presenting it here as one of the few well-documented extinctions with warming. Conversely, with animals, we all know that there's whole museums filled of the bestiaries of the ice age. And we know that about 2/3 of vertebrate genera died out over this time period. It was a hugely kind of catastrophic event for the big animals of the world. And then the bar charts here show by continent the body size distributions of the survivors in gray and the extinct taxa in red. And what you can see is it's a very size selective event. The small animals mostly survive, the big animals mostly die over this transition, with the notable exception of Africa. So to kind of summarize some of what we've kind of seen here, based upon our knowledge of the past and past global change and past ecological responses, we can say that a 5-degree warming, plus or minus, is a really big deal. There are lots with that past warming in the past. We have seen ice sheets melt. We have seen species move their ranges north. And we can see that a primary adaptation response is to shift ranges like spruce and oak in Range Mapper. We can see this red sort of ongoing series of ecosystem transformations. We can see novel systems emerge. We can see both fast and slow responses. And we can see that for plants, extinctions are rare, but are widespread for big animals. Okay, so that's kind of the big takeaways from the past. So then we think about it from a biogeography, conservation biology. How do species survive climate change? They've had to. We've had many climate changes in the past, and they have a couple of different strategies. They can persist in refugia. They can find little microhabitats that are locally favorable for them. You think about a stream with different cold water sources or shading or different sides of the hill slope. There's lots of microclimates that can create local patches favorable for a population to survive. There's then these kind of broad scale range shifts across, sort of continental scale range shifts when you have a big enough climate forcing. You can have adaptation that could be, plastic, phenotypic adaptation or genotypic adaptation. A nice example are wood rats going from big body sizes at the last glacial maximum to smaller body sizes during the Holocene. So for many animals, a smaller body size is adaptive for higher temperatures if they need to release heat. And then, of course, sometimes species don't adapt and there's extinction. This framework and this knowledge is sort of has propagated its way along with many other domains of scientific information into the federal management agencies, and the National Park Service and other management agencies are starting to adopt a framework called RAD, Resist, Accept, Direct, where given the reality of climate change and the very strong likelihood of continued trajectories of climate change over our lifetimes and careers, that we have a couple options. We can work hard to keep systems as they are in a current state, or at least slowing the rate of transformation. And in the metaphor here, if the wind is pushing you away, you spend resources and you push the boat to go upwind, maintaining position. Accept might be to drift and go where the wind pushes you, which could maybe put you on the beach or maybe put you on the rocks in this visual metaphor here. And then direct, you can try to shape the trajectories of these systems, and this metaphor, sending it to a safe harbor, the desired outcome for the manager of the boat here. Oops, that's an old. Oh yeah. So how we can help? That's this is right. So what we can do in this context and given this knowledge is, of course, as always, slowing down rates of climate change. It is always a good idea to reduce our fossil fuel emissions and thereby reduce rates of climate change. But we can also work for ways to accelerate the rates of ecological and evolutionary adaptation. We can protect key landscapes, and we can always try to do more science and try to better understand this world that's changing around us and come up with the best scenarios of how it'll change in the future. So again, when it comes to accelerating change, since we know that range shifts are an adaptive strategy for species to climate change, one thing we can do is judiciously look for ways that we can accelerate those range shifts for species of concern, species that we do not think are at high risk of unintended consequences if we translocate them to new places, but facilitating a process that is already underway. This is already a conservation strategy that is often considered or adopted for species that are vulnerable. This is the bird in New Zealand that has a few refugial populations that it's either extinct or threatened. And then this was a modeling exercise to identify habitat areas where these few remnant populations could potentially be moved to. So this is sort of an intentional relocation, managed relocation of species. This has been done in some cases if an island is a threat for being wiped out. There have been movements of endangered populations off those islands to other locations. So it's a cautiously used but available management strategy. There's also unintentional migration, and where often, as you know, people often plant charismatics in their gardens. Those charismatics can escape and start to naturalize. In the case of magnolia, which is found mostly in the southeastern U.S., there are now naturalized populations of magnolia living in New England. Presumably before Euro-Americans started planting them in their gardens, those magnolias, if they ever did accidentally seed New England, would have been wiped out by the occasional winter storm. But now they seem to not be experiencing those adverse climate effects and are able to establish and reproduce. So it may be that through gardening, we have helped magnolia expand its range northward into climates and regions that it's now adapted to, given the recent climate changes over the last century. We can also focus on key landscapes, and of course the driftless area shared by Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota, and a bit in Illinois. This one is also not just a beautiful landscape that we cherish, but it's also a very effective landscape at protecting species through all these many microhabitats and landscapes. And so this is an area of kind of high biodiversity preservation. And the Nature Conservancy has a nice mapping tool of climate resilient landscapes as priorities for conservation and land acquisition and so forth. So moving then to the science part in the last 10 or 15 minutes or so, I always love Matt Damon and his the Martian's one of my favorite movies, and the botanist out there surviving on his own using his botanical skills is one of my favorite science characters. So anyways, we have to really science the situation here and see what we can do. So here I would say for us as ecologists and plant scientists, the goal is to bring all available knowledge to bear. And this is of course not a small challenge. We have done an incredible amount of science over the last century. We have an incredible amount of data and knowledge, and we have this sort of dual challenge of both collecting new data and developing new methods whenever possible, but there's also this aggregation, collation, curation, synthesis of existing data, and every year that challenge gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But the goal is that if we can do that, then we can then use that data to inform our ecological forecasting models, give them the best available empirical basis for which these models can then be used to calibrate and then predict to scenarios of future change. Okay, so that's then the precursor for this part in building these kind of data resources here. So what I'm going to sort of show you now is, you've sort of seen me show some maps and sites, and now I want to talk a little about how this data is collected and compiled. And broadly, this is the field of paleoecology, paleoclimatology, the sort of intersection of ecology and geology. And the kinds of data that we collect it's long tail. There's many, field work is labor intensive. The laboratory work is labor intensive. A single sediment core from a lake or collected of specimens from an outcrop, or the scale of a big drilling campaign, that field work can take weeks to years, and the lab work can take years. And so lots of people are involved in this, lots of people working around the world, lots of different kinds of methods and measurement systems. And so we have a very distributed community with lots of different people measuring different things in different places in different parts of the world, working with different taxonomic groups. So this is a huge challenge that's been a persistent challenge for us. That's the bad news. But the good news for our field in this sort of paleo geo eco space is that what we're almost always doing is measuring various proxies, various indicators of past ecosystems or environments in various archives, various sedimentary contexts by depth, or some kind of depth stratigraphy, from which we estimate time. We map time onto our depth through various radiocarbonates and other age controls. And once this observation is collected, it's incredibly useful and gets reused all the time because it's a unique measurement of a system at some point in time and space, and we can keep reusing that information for all kinds of different contexts. So this then is what's led to the formation of the Neotoma Paleoecology Database. This has been supported by NSF's geoinformatics and sedimentary geology and paleobiology. It's one of others. There are other paleo data resources here, but this is one that I've been closely associated with and part of a community of people. And it's you can see here, it has worldwide coverage. There's 11 million observations. There's 20,000 sites worldwide, 33,000 data sets at these 20,000 sites. And each one of these sites represents somebody's hard work of field work and lab work. So there's an incredible amount of effort and incredible amount of knowledge that is sitting behind these dots and metrics of volume. So key characteristics, it's open data. Anybody can go to our website and our resources and start to download and look and play with the data. It's community curated, which means that we have experts kind of gathering and uploading the data. So that creates some standards for data format and taxonomic names and so forth. We have standardized variable names and taxonomies. Our data structure is able to handle multiple sites, multiple cores or other collection units per site, multiple depth horizons per core, and then multiple measurements per depth horizon. So it's this kind of layered hierarchy that can support our data. We can support, multiple age inferences, given that for us, time is an uncertain variable that we have to estimate and we can come up with different models for. And then there's a whole variety of different proxies, different fossil types or paleoclimatic measurements that we are storing here. And this is kind of an incomplete list. This is ongoing. We continue to grow. You can see these growth curves up on our Neotoma homepage. You can see the most recently added sites here in the widget at right. And if you want to start to get in there, we try to support multiple audiences and multiple use cases through multiple platforms. And one of our most popular sort of tried and true resources, and one that's worth playing with, is Explore. Explore is where you can start to search for data, and you can start to then retrieve different sites and data set types. Once you retrieve a site, you can then click on a dot here to get this little lookup field about the name and the characteristics, and then the data sets here. And then once you click on the data set type, you can actually pull up the data table and then the diagram here. And so here for Cupola Pond in Missouri, you can see, again, lots of spruce and pine, last ice age, then lots of the hardwoods and so forth. And so if you're working, what's available in Iowa, you can pretty quickly start to figure out what's available in Iowa, or you can search by plant taxon if you really care about oak or some other taxon, with always the knowledge that, it's an incomplete fossil record. So we don't have every, plants, every species of interest, but we have many, and there's lots that can be looked at here. We also support our data contributors by providing DOIs for all contributed data sets. And we have individual landing pages for these data sets so that Google data sets or other web crawlers can search and retrieve these data. And then we have most of the people who are power users are using our R package and are downloading data from the Neotoma Central into the R environment, and then doing different kinds of analyses using various packages available in R. So with that then, there's lots of science underway, and there's this funny thing of creating this resource, and I do my science based on it, and then but so do other people, and so sometimes it's like, oh gosh, that's a paper I would have loved to do, but somebody else got to it first, and that's part of the acceptance of building an open resource, that it's open to everybody, and you're accelerating the community discovery of knowledge by making these data open and available to all. So this is a paper that I actually was a part of, and it's a paper I'm really happy about. It was led by a team in Norway, Andre Model and Suzette Flantua. And what we're looking at here is a compilation across these continents you see here of vegetation rates of change based upon networks of pollen data across all these continents for the last 18,000 years. And there's a couple different metrics being shown here, but the thing that these records pretty consistently show is that there's one peak of change in which there's fast rates of change, 10 to 12 to 14,000 years ago, North America is here. And that's the end of the last ice age. That's a transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene. That's the melting of the world ice sheets and the warming that goes with it. That's what I reviewed in the start of this talk. But then there's the second peak, and that's here, and that's probably us. That's probably humans, and not just Euro-American arrival. That's a big part of it. Native American societies and so forth, and these records suggest a growing human footprint beginning sort of 2 to 3 to 4,000 years ago, depending on where you are. And so really starting to put in scale that it's not just climate change that's driving this, but there's human agency and land use as well. And the two together are the major drivers of vegetation change over this time period. Another nice paper came out the same year by a mostly different team. This was a paper I was not a part of. Did a similar analysis, but then looking at the islands around the world, and you can sort of see each orange dot is an island somewhere. And I'll look at Tenerife as an example here. The blue curve is an ordination of the plant communities based upon the pollen assemblages. You can see that many of these blue curves show an inflection point at which something started to change, and Tenerife is a nice example. And then the orange line is our best available date of human arrival on the islands. And so we can so that's based on the archaeological record. And what you can see is that many islands, the timing of human arrival is different. When did humans sort of explore and populate the world? But that timing of human arrival often corresponds to a major inflection point in vegetation change at that time. Also, we can start to use these kind of data for invasive species detections and historical records. That's using some of the more aquatic records here. This is a freshwater diatom that's invasive in the US and developing hypotheses about that. People have used, there's other groups that have used image libraries of pollen grains and have cross-referenced their image libraries. This is the Global Pollen Project with our maps of pollen distribution. So if you think you have a spruce pollen grain in your collection, you can look at the image libraries here in the Global Pollen Project and then link to the maps in Neotoma. So there's a nice kind of other teams building resources drawing on Neotoma capabilities. And then as I talked about here, Range Mapper being built really for public audiences, drawing upon research quality data resources, but then presenting in a way accessible for a broad variety of audiences. And then, near the end, but not least, museums picking up on Neotoma data. This is from the UC Museum in Berkeley of paleoecology, and then making some really nice online displays about where were extinct animals in the past, and using Neotoma to be the data resource that they can then build their own front-end maps and visualizations for. So this is a kind of data science that we do that then powers both our research and then powers our outreach and communications about climate change and the effects of climate change on ecosystems. And what's really essential here is that these data are open, they're high quality, they're community curated, they're community governed. There's both the database itself, there are supporting software services and a well-linked community. And then once you have this and kind of put it out there to the world, lots of people start using it for all kinds of different things. And there's lots of ways for people to learn more or to help and join. So I'm happy to talk more about what those ways might be. Okay, so I'll stop there. And of course, as you can clearly see, this is a work of many. This is me presenting the work of both people in my lab, people at the leadership level in Neotoma. There's a leadership council there's IT development team involved, and then there's many different people who serve in the role of data stewards who curate and upload the data, and contributors and so forth. And our support funding wise is mostly come from NSF, Geoinformatics, EarthCube, DEB, SGP, and macro systems. So we've had different support from different places over the year. So I'll stop here and I'll take questions. And Alyssa, thank you again for being chat moderator and putting some of the links in as we've gone along the way.